All right, everybody. Let me welcome you. Let me welcome you back after a little bit of an unexpected break, and thanks for coming back. Let me start by thanking you for your prayers for both Kate and I. We had a rough couple of weeks between the two of us. By Tuesday of last week, I was about ready to throw in the towel. I just wanted to be done. But just a couple of days later, was doing pretty well. But I felt your prayers all week long, and so did Kate. We're both really grateful. We went absolutely nowhere. I had the onset of this illness on Saturday evening, very late Saturday evening, early Sunday morning. And Michelle had a wonderful idea that particular Sunday that we would have a hymn sing. So if you were in that service, I'm sure you enjoyed that. Debbie Ingram does a great job of leading things like that. But I also had my niece's wedding last weekend in Sterling, Kansas, which is where my sister lives on a family farm. And we were concerned for obvious reasons. So I was talking to Heather all week, my sister, and by Thursday, I was feeling all right. Symptoms were more or less gone by then. I called her and said, "Hey, what do you want us to do? Here's kind of where things are." And she said, "No, I think we've all talked about it. We're good. We want you to come on up." So Kate and I talked about it. Friday morning, we headed that way. By Friday evening, I didn't have any more symptoms at all, and the rest of the weekend went fine. So I have some pictures I'll show you sometime. I might show a few on Sunday of the wedding from last weekend. It was really pretty. They had the wedding on her farm. Heather and John, they have a farm with about 6,000 acres, so it's a fairly large farm. And they have just recently built a new home. The family farmstead has been there. I think John is the 6th generation to be there. But the original family home burned down about 2.5 years ago, so they rebuilt. And it took them better part of a year and a half to build the new house. So they haven't been in it very long. They got to have the wedding out on the front steps of the new house, and weather was perfect, which is always a gamble with outdoor weddings. I was talking with Megan and Chris about this just last night, and Logan and Robin, because we were talking about Megan and Chris's upcoming wedding, and Megan really does not want to have an outdoor wedding at all. And so she was asking me for memories that I have of outdoor weddings, and so I started thinking back through them. I've been doing this for 20 years now, so I've done a few. And I said, I started telling her all the stories, and I have a lot of them. Had a beautiful wedding at a winery where it started raining the day of. It was a winery in Stroud. Stroud has a lot of wineries there. They wanted to have it in the vineyard, so they rented it out and had everything set up. And we went out the day of the wedding. It was just raining terribly. And so we're standing inside. The winery was at one time the first church in Stroud, Roman Catholic church, little white church, really pretty building, but it had been purchased by this family when it closed. Anyway, we're inside, and I'm looking at the bride, and she's in her wedding dress, and I'm in a full-on robe and everything, and I'm like, "Well, what do you want to do? Do you want to just do the wedding inside?" She talks about it with her groom, and they're like, "Nope, we want to go ahead and do it outside." So we walked outside. Now, weddings normally are not real long, so this one in particular was short. It was about 15 minutes. But we went outside, 15 minutes, standing there in the rain, and we were drenched. I don't know, her dress had to have been ruined. I still have, you know how pages in a book will get crinkly when they get wet and dry out? My book of worship still has those crinkly pages from that day. So anyway, I was telling all these stories last night to them, and as I thought through it, I realized that this is the only outdoor wedding that I have a memory of having good weather for. In 20 years of doing those, it's the only one that I have. So they're always hit and miss. Yes, oh my gosh. Usually here in Oklahoma, there's a couple of really pretty outdoor venues here in the metro, and then also some in some of the smaller towns outside. And I did like 3 or 4 weddings at this one ranch about an hour from here over the course of 4 or 5 years. And I never did a single wedding out there where the wind was just not sweeping down the plains, And it sounds pretty when you're thinking about it, but then every time we get out there, the bride's, got the wedding dress and everything, and every time her hair, whoever it is, her hair's been blowing, a dress has been blowing, train has been blowing, and they end up getting frustrated. And so it's Always better sometimes, well, sometimes better in your head than it comes out in person. Is it an outdoor wedding? I'll start praying now for that. That's good. That's a good, yeah, having a backup plan is a wise alternative. Um, and you know, there are a lot of stories of pretty ones, but ask me sometimes, I have more stories of bad weather than I do of anything else. But it was a good time, and I said all that to thank you for your prayers because, as I said, we definitely felt them. We're feeling fine, doing fine. I'm back to running in the mornings again, and we're grateful to be on the downside of that, but we're grateful for the church family. A whole lot of people checked in on us, a lot of prayers, and we're just thankful for that. Okay, I wanted to tell you, for those of you who were here before we stopped doing this Thursday morning Bible study pre-COVID, I would do the best I could to share things that were happening in the church on Thursday morning. So sometimes you get information before everybody else does. That's not really the case today, but I do want to make sure that you know that coming this Sunday, if you can be there for the spaghetti dinner and the members meeting this coming Sunday, that would be a good thing. We're gonna, Kyle French had asked to step away from the administrative team, wanted to take some time off, and in fairness, he'd been there a really long time, but the administrative team asked him to come back, so he's accepted. But because of the process in the Book of Discipline, we have to actually vote to reinstate him. So we're gonna put that before the members on Sunday. We're also gonna expand the administrative team by one slot, and the administrative team is bringing nominations to the floor of the members meeting on Sunday. And so one of those nominations will be that Kyle French be reinstated. I should say Dr. Kyle French. The other nomination will be to bring Orville Tate onto the administrative team to represent the Homeless Outreach Mobile Ministry. I've been talking with the administrative team about that, and they're in total agreement with me that we actually only have one member of that team other than myself who's ever been out to the Homeless Outreach, and that would be Chris. Chris was out there one time. I think he was out there one time. And so I've asked the members of the administrative team to get out to the Homeless Outreach. I know it's hard, a lot of folks work and whatnot, but at least one time this year. And I've also asked my staff to do the same thing, to get out there at least one time this year. Part of the reason for that is because even if you were to separate the homeless outreach part of our mobile ministry, it would still be the largest outreach and one of the probably almost the largest single thing we do here at Southern Hills, almost. Our virtual campus, as you know, is enormous. But I was telling a couple of people about this on Tuesday, we have more people show up at the homeless outreach on Tuesday than we do on campus here on Sunday morning. It's a very large ministry. And so if you add the mobile meal ministry into that, obviously it's that much bigger, number of volunteers and the number of people we're serving. So as I've been talking with the admin team, I said, you know, as we're together making decisions about the allocation of resources and priorities for the church, I think it's pretty important that we have people on the team who have an experience and awareness of the largest ministry that we're running right now. And they totally agreed with that. They're going to do the best they can to get out and be a part of that sometime this year. But we are going to recommend that we bring somebody from that ministry on to be a part of advocating for it. So we'll ask him to serve a period, and then we'll also be asking once his period of service is up. Have you ever seen those memes that go around on social media like Facebook, where there's a picture, I don't mean to be grotesque, but there's like a picture of a skeleton staring out of a window, and the caption says, and then the church said they just needed somebody to fill in a position for a little while, you know? We want to make sure we're not asking somebody to stay in a role forever, so we're going to be asking somebody else to serve in that position once Orville's had the chance to be in there for a year or maybe 2 years, so that we can make sure that that ministry is really well represented. So be there to help us with that and vote on that. Also be there to support the spaghetti dinner if you can do that. That would be wonderful. We would appreciate the kids are trying to raise money to go to camps this year because we're kind of back into all that now. We're having camps for children and youth, and the church has always done its part to help send our kids there. So the last thing I'm going to tell you is that we will be having a survey on Sunday, too, at the members' meeting. And that survey is going to ask how our members feel about their interest in Wednesday night ministries. Sunday mornings have been growing. Our on-campus attendance has been inching up this year, most of the Sundays. Virtual campus attendance is always good. The Tuesday homeless outreach mobile ministry, again, is next to the virtual campus, the biggest thing we do. The Thursday morning Bible study, we have good attendance at every week, both on campus and online. And so we have not had good attendance on Wednesday night. And so one of the questions that we had, that the administrative team had was, well, what is there, really, let me say this differently, because really the questions are kind of twofold. One is there a way to do something on Wednesday night that provides more value so that our members would be more interested in being present for it? And so we want to know that. The other thing we want to know is Wednesday night just not a good time anymore? I remember growing up and church days were like Sunday morning and Wednesday night, right? I know a lot of things changed in the last 2 years, and one of the questions we had was, is this just one of those things that changed? So we have like one family that comes on Wednesday night, and also my family. And so I was sitting around last night talking with our staff and some of the people. It's like, so, why do you think people aren't coming? And they said, well, it could be, a lot of things. People always throw out a lot of things. But probably the most consistent thing that came out of that was that some of them said, we have just days where at the end of the work day, at the end of the day, even if we're not working, we're just tired. We're just tired, and it's kind of hard to get out, even if we want to be here. So our administrative team wants to get a little information so that we can figure out, we'll keep doing this Wednesday night thing through spring this year. We'll take a break in the summer. And then we're going to try to figure out what to do in the fall. And if our members come back and say, yeah, it's just not really a good time for us, we'll figure it out. We'll put our resources into the things that are working. But if our members are like, well, actually, we'd really love to do this on Wednesday night, then we'll do this that our members tell us about. So you could be there. You could also spread the word as much as you can with your friends between now and Sunday, because we just really want honest feedback so we can figure out what to do that'll provide value. All right, that's enough of that. Let's talk about Genesis. We are in, oh goodness, this was last night's passage. We are in Genesis chapter 7 this week. So the last time we met together, we took chapters 5 and 6 together. Chapters 5 and 6 represent a major moment in Old Testament history and in the movement of the Old Testament storyline, because there's a big difference between pre-Diluvian history and antediluvian history. And I've been using those words just so you'll know them, just so you'll hear them. You're not going to use those in your everyday speech, but if you're ever reading a Bible study or something like that and you see those words, they're words that aren't theological words. History uses them as well to refer to the era of history pre-flood and the era of history post-flood, which is an easier way to say it, but they say pre-diluvian and antediluvian because I think it makes the scholars feel like they're smarter. So there's a major shift in the way that the narrative of history, particularly in this case Old Testament history, Jewish history, and eventually Christian history, from the time of the flood onward. So today we're going to dig into the story of the flood itself. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that happen in the flood, and then we'll work on the post-flood history starting next week. So as you often hear me say, the scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray. Let's do that. God, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather together today, especially after having not been able to do so for a time. We're grateful for the opportunity to learn, and in learning, to grow toward becoming the people that you're calling us to be. So we give you thanks for our fellowship this morning, and we give you thanks for the movement of the Holy Spirit. We pray, God, that you would open our hearts and open our minds and open our spirits so that we might hear what you would have us hear, learn what you would have us learn, and grow in the way that you're calling us to grow. And this we ask in your name. Amen. Okay, Genesis 7. There are a couple of things here, particularly right at the beginning, that I don't like in the translation, and a lot of scholars don't. That's unusual in the translation that I read. The accuracy and readability of this translation is the reason I use this Bible, but this sentence is very misleading, and so you end up reading it incorrectly, and it almost gives you a sense of a works-based righteousness. And when I talk about the translation there, what I mean is this. Sometimes at the start of a Bible study, I'm sure some of you have seen this in years past here, I will bring out a copy of the Greek New Testament that I have and also a copy of the Hebrew Old Testament and just pass it around so you can see them. Because they are modern reproductions of the original languages in which these were written, which is obviously not English. When you read the scriptures in the original language, after you understand the syntax of those two languages, Koine Greek and Ancient Aramaic, the meaning is a little different than often what is lost in translation. The phrase lost in translation is a phrase because it's valid. And so I have to remind myself, and I try to remind others from time to time, that anyone who engages Christianity from a Western European and then subsequently American perspective is the product of a missionary effort. We're converted by missionaries from the Middle East because it is a Middle Eastern religion. As a result, and you can make a strong case that Christianity is a heavily Mediterranean religion. That's solid. Either way, you're looking at a couple of things that are important to understand. And one is that syntax patterns in different languages vary from the way that syntax patterns in English work. English works that way, even from the difference in syntax between British English and American English. So the syntax patterns are different, and that leads to different understandings. The other thing that is different is that cultures have different ways of expressing thought through language. So every culture, and you'll learn this, if you have traveled, you already know this. If you have not traveled very much outside of the United States, then this is something you will learn. And you can see it even developing within the US. There's a sociologist who believes that eventually the United States is going to evolve into 6 distinctly separate regions. Right now, we already have dialectic differences that are developing, and we haven't even been a country for very long, so I'm sure that will probably happen. But outside of the US and other cultures, it's even more pronounced. And as I said, if you've traveled, you know that. There are different ways of expressing thought via language in different cultures. While there are far more nuanced examples of that, probably one of the easiest to understand is that some cultures are much more fact, or what they believe is fact, and intellectually oriented in their communication, and others are much more oriented toward communicating truth through story. Now, there are several other cultural differences in the way that thought is communicated through language, but that's an easy one, I think, to begin to understand how those differences work. What do I mean by that? Some cultures, even some cultures today, are going to seek to communicate truth to you through story when they communicate. I'm going to tell the story, I think, this Sunday, I haven't decided for sure yet, about an organization called the Mercy Project. Chris Field started that in, I think, 2009, and it was a nonprofit NGO that developed as a way to begin to rescue children in Ghana from human trafficking. The first time I encountered that, my brain naturally went to sex trafficking because I tend to equate the two. And he said in a podcast recently, he's like, yeah, back in 2009, I mean, people knew what trafficking was, but nobody was really talking about it that much. A lot of light has been shed on that today, and particularly in the US, we tend to equate human trafficking with human sex trafficking, which is a big problem in the US, particularly here on I-40 that goes right through the metro. It's one of the major thoroughfares for human sex trafficking. But he said, outside of the US, while that is an issue, slavery is a bigger issue outside of the US than it is in the US, and so there's a lot of human trafficking for slavery. And when he went to Ghana in the early 2000s, he found that families would sell their children as slaves on fishing boats on what is the largest man-made lake in the world in Ghana. And they had been doing this for generations in spite of the fact that slavery is illegal in Ghana. And so they found that families, they didn't want to sell their children into slavery, But for most of them, because of a high degree of poverty, that was the system that had developed in order for people to be able to eat. They would sell their kids into slavery, hoping that perhaps their children would be able to eat some of the fish that they were able to catch on the fishing boats while they were working as slaves on the fishing boats. And later found that a lot of the fishing boat captains were formerly children who had been sold into slavery themselves, right? So they end up going to Ghana and trying to create a way to begin to rescue kids from this kind of trafficking into slavery. And they create a number of, instead of just raising money, they end up creating sustainable fishing methods. Really interesting thing. They end up creating sustainable fishing methods that they teach to the fishing boat captains that are cheaper and produce more than the slave labor does. So they have to date rescued 207 children, all of whom have been given back voluntarily by the fishing boat captains, and none of whom have been re-trafficked, which I think is an amazing thing. But he tells the story of how when he went there, he was an American, and he had all these ideas about what to do, but he knew that we have a tendency to force our ideals onto other cultures, and so he wanted to listen first, and he did. And as he listened to what was needed from the people of Ghana, this organization, their entire employee base, aside from the leadership in the U.S., the two people who lead it in the U.S., all of their employees are Ghanaian. They would say, hey, we have these ideas. And the Ghanaian employees would say, no, you can't say that here. Nobody will understand that. What you're communicating about your plan. So they would say like, well, here's our problem. Here's a plan. The CEO, Chris, would be like, here's a plan I have to try to address this problem. And the Ghanaians would be like, well, you can't communicate it that way. They would say, most of the people in the villages we're going to have the equivalent of a first-grade education in the U.S. They might be able to write their names and they might be able to count to 50, but beyond that, they don't. And they said, you're talking to us, the Ghanaians employees or graduates, most of them of African University. They said, we can follow your train of thought, but a lot of people in these small towns we're going to go to, they're not going to be able to do that. And so Chris is like, well, how do we communicate? How do we essentially say this in a way they're going to hear it? And the Ghanaian said, you got to tell it in a story. Everything that is told here is told, all truth is communicated through story. They said, you're going to be sitting under a mango tree telling a story to people who may not have eaten in 2 days. And what you're going to have to do through the story is convince them that what you're communicating to them is worth their time, energy, and effort. So Chris will talk about, it's a great podcast, Chris talks about how he learned how to tell stories in a way that communicated the truth he was trying to communicate together with his Ghanaian employees. Contrast that with one of the reasons why most American Christians like the Gospel of Luke, which is that it is the most historically accurate and fact-based book in the Bible. Because so many books of the Bible seek to communicate truth through story as well, coming out of a Middle Eastern culture that still relies heavily on that to this day. Luke seeks to offer information according to a chronological timeline and seeks to verify the information he offers with other verifiable facts about history. And the brains of Americans trained in an American school system, whether it be public or private is irrelevant, are taught to look for fact that way in terms of what's communicated to us. If I'm going to develop a strategic plan, which I have for the church, that strategic plan is not communicated in the form of story. I'm not telling the amazing stories of people to try to get us to do something. I'll do that from the pulpit because our verbal communication works that way. But if I'm going to present something like a strategic plan, I have to have a goal and a series of steps for us to meet that goal because that's how our brains work. So all of that is to say that different cultures communicate differently. If you're not, why spend time on that? Because if you're not keeping that in mind when you're reading the Bible, if you're not keeping in mind that you are reading the Bible disconnected from its authors in both time and in geography, which means that you're culturally disconnected, then you're going to read something written in one culture and during one time in a very specific way, according to the way you would expect to read something written in your culture and in your time. Why is that dangerous? Because that's often one of the two things that lies at the heart of scriptural misinterpretation. The other is I already have an idea about what I think is right, and I'm just looking for things to support it. That's a totally different conversation. But one of the two major issues with scriptural misinterpretation is that we forget that it's written by a culture, in a culture, during a time, for a culture. And people will say, yes, but the Holy Spirit can illuminate. Well, we know that, right? You know what one of the ways the Holy Spirit illuminates this is? By reminding us that it was written for another culture, by another culture, in another time, so that when we're reading it, we're conscious of that fact. So one of the questions we need to ask is, how were they saying what they say, and what were they trying to say? Which is the whole reason, by the way, that churches ever tried to discern the call of one person or two maybe to be the minister of the congregation and then send them away to school where they could learn the languages that the rest of the congregation frankly doesn't have the time to go and learn. So you could have somebody who's like, yeah, I learned this. Here's what it actually means. That's what we're going to do with this very first verse. Because if you read is it the first? Yeah, very first verse. If you read this very first verse, you're going to get a strong sense of works-based righteousness. And that is the opposite of scriptural theology. It's also the opposite of what's being said here. And when you read it in, we often say that the scriptures the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. That's sort of true. It's actually an old version of Aramaic that was reconstituted, and they used modern Hebrew to reconstitute that and figure it out because they're so similar. So as we go through this, one of the things to remember is that I'm going to tell you what it says here and what we're inclined to read out of it when we read it translated in English based on reading it from our perspective and through our lenses, the lenses of our culture and our time, and also then what it actually says when you read it in Hebrew. Let's do that. So the Lord, you're going to see two different ways that God is referenced all throughout Genesis really, but repeatedly in this chapter. One is as the Lord. The other is as God. And so there is a reason for that. Most scholars say that there are three separate sources that go into the book of Genesis. And two of them are referenced here. The priestly writer and the Yahwist writer. So the priestly writer and the Yahwist are just two designations for two different people that they think contributed to the story of Genesis. One of them, the Yahwist, tends to use the term Yahweh, whereas the priestly writer tends to use the word Elohim. Yahweh, and so in Hebrew, people will tell you that when you see Yahweh written, it's just YHWH. Have you heard that? It's just written YHWH. They'll also say that it's a sacred name. Jewish people wouldn't pronounce it. After the scribes wrote it, they would go and wash themselves, ritually clean, and come back. All of that is true as best we know it. But Yahweh is not a strange word. There are no vowels in Hebrew, none whatsoever. So the word markings in Hebrew are all consonants. So Yahweh is not a strange word. The thing is that because it was ancient Hebrew, ancient Aramaic, because that was lost, when scholars were reconstituting it, they had to add vowels to make it make sense. So when you read modern Hebrew today, or even ancient reconstituted Hebrew, you'll see the word markings. They look like little pictures. I'll bring my Bible next week so you can see it. Then you'll see a series of dots and dashes above and below the consonants. That's what was added by scholars when they were trying to figure out the language again, to represent vowels. So when you read it today, the vowels are represented by the dots and slashes and things above and below the consonant pictures, but the consonant pictures were what remained. That's what they found. So when you see Yahweh, YHWH, same would be true for Elohim. Any word written in Hebrew, particularly ancient Hebrew or Aramaic, has no vowels in it at all. So you have the Yahwist writer who refers to God by Yahweh, which is God's name. Does anybody remember what the word Yahweh means? Something close to, people will say means that I am. God says, my name is I am. A better translation, or probably the best translation, is people have also, or scholars have said this by saying a couple of things. First, I am he who is. It actually means I am he who is. But there's no gender in it. So properly translated, it is I am the one that exists. That's what it means. I am the one that is. I am the one that exists. Philosophers, once they figured that out, loved it, because that connects philosophically to the idea of the necessary being. The only reason other things can exist is because the necessary being exists, right? So the other word that you're going to see here is God, which is Elohim. Ruach Elohim usually refers to the breath of God or the Spirit of God. You see that in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters of the deep. That's Ruach Elohim, right? Elohim means something, it's more like a title, more of a title for God than a name for God. So you have those two different authors most likely contributing to this chapter, which is also why you see some redundancy in it. Some of that redundancy is from the format in which the prose is written, but you see some redundancy because you have two different authors contributing to this. You also see a little bit of discrepancy in how the numbers of the animals are indicated that come into the ark. In some case you have a pair, in some case you have 7, right? And scholars have tried to handle that in two ways. The scholars who want to believe that there's only one author, which is not well received, say, oh, that's not true. That's just the way to handle plurality in the Hebrew language. That's not true. Most likely you're talking about two separate traditions merged together into one. And so does it matter how many animals were on the ark? Personally, not to me. That's never been the source of an issue with my faith. I think the message is the same. We see something very similar with the story of Utnapishtim and Atrahasis, which are the other two ancient stories that refer to the flood. They have a similar narrative about animals being put on a boat. So keep that in mind as we're reading through this together and talking about it. And it may help may help to identify that when you're seeing it. All right, here we go. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark with your whole household, because among this generation I've seen that you're a moral man." Did you catch that? So the flood is coming, right? Noah's supposed to build the ark. We already talked about that. God has said, I'm going to put some animals on the ark. Remember last time we were together, God said, I've seen the hearts of this generation. Every thought of their heart is evil all the time. And that was reiterated a couple of times. So we already know we're going into a decreational event, right? Essentially, what we're moving back toward is the same kind of description of the world that exists in Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters of the deep. What we're getting in a minute, we're going to see a reference to where the waters of the deep are released. So there is water that comes from above and water that comes from below. Do you remember our conversation about the way that Jewish people envisioned the world? That the waters above are held back by the dome and the waters below are held back by the earth. And those waters are the waters of chaos. They're different in scope than simply rain. So we get rain here, but the rain is coming because the barrier has been breached by God so that the waters of chaos return to the world, essentially putting the world back in the same space that it was in Genesis 1. So scholars will talk about this as a decreational event so that another creation can happen. But at this time, instead of creating humankind, Adam, out of the earth, God is saving humankind and also some of all the rest of creation to repopulate the earth. So when God here says, go into the ark with your whole household, listen to this, because among this generation I've seen that you're a moral man. When you read that, that most likely gives the impression that Noah is being saved because he's good, right? And if you read it in English that way, it's difficult to get a different interpretation. The thing is that there's a way to write that in Hebrew that would result in what you're getting out of it. And the way to write that in Hebrew would use an entirely different word than the word that is used. It would use the word yada, in fact. It would use an entirely different word than the word that is used. So the word that's used in Hebrew, the way it's written in Hebrew, if you were to translate it directly, which again is hard to do in both Hebrew or Greek, says something more like this. The Lord said to Noah, or God commanded Noah. Actually, in Hebrew it says God spoke to Noah in a commanding tone. Go into the ark with your whole household. That is right. Because, let me get this right. Because I have seen you. Go into the ark because I've seen you, a moral man. Have you ever heard me talk about how important it is that you put emphasis on the right syllable when you're trying to communicate something to somebody, right? If we speak in strange patterns, we get a strange meaning. So when you put emphasis on the wrong syllable, you get an entirely different meaning out of it, right? You can do that with some words and phrases and get an entirely different meaning if you put an emphasis on one word in the sentence versus another word in the sentence. So the way this is written in Hebrew, it says, go into the ark. God spoke to Noah in a commanding way. Go into the ark, and then a subsequent command, take your entire household, the whole thing, which is not the only part. The Noah movie that had, is it Russell Crowe in it? Obviously it deviates a little bit. I never have a problem with that because you have to tell a story. But probably the largest deviation is that Noah tries to end the lives of his offspring on the boat, thinking that humanity shouldn't continue, and that's not part of the narrative. God says, when you read it's like a subsequent command, take your whole family, right? And then, because I've seen you, and then tangentially, I can never get that out right, a moral man. Seen you in that context is akin to the word that is used for know. So a good translation of that is, because I know you. And then, a righteous man is added on in the same way that every adjectival descriptor phrase is in every other part of Hebrew. It's not the thrust of the phrase. It would be akin to saying, because I know you, you have blonde hair. Because I know you, you're 6 feet tall. Because I know you, you have a red pickup. That doesn't mean that his moral nature isn't a factor here. It is, adjectively. But the important part of it is that if you're a Hebrew person and reading this in that language, what you're getting out of it is Noah is being asked to go on the ark because God knows him. Connected back to the previous chapter, Noah is the only one alive who knows God in that time. That's really important because Jesus is going to reference that later on down the road. Last week you studied the prodigal son, right, on Sunday morning, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, which says the same thing. Jesus tries time and time again to disconnect our notion of love. Well, first off, Jesus tries time and again to connect our notion of salvation to our notion of love. Jesus tries to teach that over and over again. Start connecting salvation to love. But then Jesus also tries to disconnect love from behavior. And so like in the prodigal son, you have this story of the younger son. You know, the word prodigal. Do you know what the word, Becky knows because you were there last night. You know what the word prodigal means? When we think about prodigal, we usually think about someone who's coming back, like wayward, coming back. At least that's how I've always thought of it. You know what it means? The word means reckless. The word prodigal actually means reckless. So the younger son is reckless. You've got these two stories, and you cannot tell one without the other. The younger son is reckless, so is the older son. What is the younger son reckless with? Good question, I'm glad you asked that. The younger son in the prodigal story is reckless with his inheritance. God is specifically, in both instances, the story that Jesus is telling is a story directed at Israel in two capacities. And the first is, you have been reckless with your inheritance, right? You were given something, really post-flood, and then with the Abrahamic covenant, you were given something that was unique to you, that instead of cherishing, you squandered. The next question should be, what is that inheritance? And that question is answered with the second son, wherein at the end of that narrative, the father, representing God, says to the son, the son's like, you know the story, right? Son's upset, older son's upset, because he'd been here doing all the good things. And the younger son is still accepted back. So with the younger son, you have son did bad things and is still accepted by the father. When the son comes to his senses, has already practiced his speech, he's running home, and while the father sees him a long way out, the father starts running towards the son the minute the father sees the son coming back. You're supposed to see in that kind of what could also be called a prodigal love or a reckless love. God's love is being offered proactively. God's love is proactive, right? Sacrificial, unconditional. But the prodigal, the son, the reckless son who squandered the inheritance, starts to issue the apology. What does the father do? Doesn't address it at all. Wraps his arm around his son, puts a cloak around him, and starts to celebrate. Doesn't even address the apology. If I'm not mistaken, I'd have to read it again. I think he even cuts his son off. May not. But he doesn't even address the apology that his son makes. They just go to celebrate, right? What are you supposed to get out of that? That the idea that you've connected behavior to love is not scriptural. You do not get denied access to heaven, and how do you make that connection? That would be a good question. Because you're talking about being given access to the presence of the Father, the presence of God. The younger son is not denied access to the presence of God because of his behavior. The bad things he did not keep him from being in God's presence. That should lead to some questions. But if you have grown up in a culture, and most of us have, talk about the broken ethic of a wounded world, that connects love and behavior. People who don't know, who have not taken the opportunity to get to know God for themselves tend to teach Christianity as if the purpose of religion is to enforce a moral code, as opposed to the purpose of religion being an opportunity to affect communal spirituality. So on the one hand, you have a whole group of people who use religion to try to enforce an idea of right and wrong. And on the other hand, you have a whole group of people who use religion as a way to affect community spirituality that leads to a greater sense of individual and communal health. Those are two very different versions of Christianity that are commingled, one being much larger than the other, which is why there are a lot of authors that say Christians today practice a functional form of deism because they don't believe God can speak to them. You've heard me say this. I'm going to say it again now because I want it to stick with you. I was sitting with my mentor and having that same issue. He was talking to me about how to get to know God's voice, just like all the saints have always said. John Wesley, I was talking about this with Michelle the other day. John Wesley used to talk about how God has to awaken your senses so that you can hear God's Spirit. Some scholars have said only one person in 1,000 will believe that it's possible to communicate with God, and only one person in that 1,000 will seek it out and do it, which is tragic, right? So I'm talking about this with my mentor years ago because the saints, like Wesley, and I think Wesley says it well, says that God awakens your spiritual senses, your seeing eye and your hearing ears, so that God teaches you how to commune with God, how to communicate with God. Well, I was talking about this with my mentor because I was skeptical. I'm like, well, I don't think it works that way. When God speaks, it's always through maybe a sunset or something, or somebody said something and it connected with me or something like that. And my mentor was like, yeah, no, that makes sense, right? And then he said, Matt, do you believe God is omnipotent, which means all-powerful? And I said, yeah, I do. With these three questions, I'm afraid to say no, but I do actually believe them, but I'm not going to say no, Do you believe God is omnipotent? Yes. Do you believe God is omniscient, which means knows everything? Yes. Do you believe that God is omnipresent, but everywhere present? Yes. And my mentor then said, okay, so you tell me, Matt, what makes more sense here? That God is all-powerful, but somehow doesn't have the ability to communicate with what God made? Or that you just haven't experienced it yet? If God is all-powerful, then are you saying God is not powerful enough to figure out how to communicate with the creation God? Especially when every story in the Scriptures is a story, not everyone, but you get it. Almost every story in the Scripture is a story of God communicating with what God has made. You think all of a sudden God stopped. There are actually people, theologians, who say communication with God stopped at the end of a certain point in the Bible. And the rest of the scholars are like, that's the dumbest thing that we've ever, nothing in the Scriptures, even post-resurrection, we have Jesus communicating with people, right? So you have this idea of kind of a functioning deism. How are you using your religion is a question that we should be asking of ourselves, right? Because you see that in the story. The younger son, Israel, has squandered their inheritance, but their behavior does not prevent them from access to God. Often you'll hear me say, when you find something in the Scriptures that makes you begin to wonder if what you were taught somewhere, probably in your culture, more so than in your church, doesn't match up with what Jesus taught or what the Scriptures teach, you ought to sit back and think about that for a minute, together with God. Because then you have the older son. The question I should ask is, okay, twofold. What was their inheritance, right? And what is it then that either allows access with God or prevents it? You know, if it's not behavior, what is it? Well, that's why you have the older son. The older son is like, in this case, the rest of Israel or us, because we don't question why bad things happen. We question why bad things happen to good people. We are fine with people that we have decided are bad being punished, usually. We're not fine with people that have done good things not being rewarded, especially if we feel like we've been doing really good things and somebody else gets the same reward. Jesus tells these stories like over and over and over again. There are people who, you know the story about the people who come to work in the field at different points of the day, and then at the end of the day, they all get the same wages, and the people at the beginning were like, wait a minute, why don't we get more money? You know, we worked harder. And the owner of the field, again, God, is like, did I not give you what I promised you? You know, everybody's getting the same thing, and it's mine to give to whom I give it to. Did I not give you what you promised? But we have this idea that better behavior should result in greater reward. And that's been codified in our religion outside of the Scriptures, like jewels in your crown. Have you ever heard those statements? Or the size of your mansion in heaven, those kinds of things. And yet that's entirely the opposite of what the Scripture says. And we see that here. But the prodigal, the older son is much like us and much like Israel. Well, if these people didn't do the right thing, the issue is twofold. You shouldn't be accepting them back, certainly not celebrating them. And also, why aren't you celebrating me? Because I did the right thing, right? I was doing the right stuff the whole time while they were doing the wrong stuff. Why am I not getting more? And the father here said, I should turn to it, but the father says lovingly, dude, you've been with me the whole time. You could have had access to me anytime you wanted. Did you catch that? You've been with me the whole time. Could have had me anytime you wanted. What is the inheritance that we squandered? The inheritance that we, or in this case Israel, but also us, squandered is the availability of relationship with God, which is, by the way, what grants us access to God. So the answer is not your behavior. The answer, scripturally, is God grants us access to God because God chooses to, but that it is our decision to pursue friendship with God that makes the difference. So time and again, and if you ask me, if you want to sit down sometime, maybe sometime we should do a Bible study of all the stories that Jesus tells that have that very same message to them, because that is the thrust of the Scriptures. We don't like that because we want to, you know, if we've been trying to do good things so that we could go to heaven, interestingly, if you use your religion as and I don't know if you do or not, but a lot of people do, if you use your religion as a way to enforce a moral code, right, if you fall into that camp, versus communal spirituality and movement toward spiritual health individually and as a community. So if you use it to enforce a moral code, then your version of salvation, I've yet to hear somebody who sees their religion that way communicate salvation to me as anything other than about morality. Your salvation is always about doing good things and being forgiven for the bad things you did. Right? So people will say, oh, no. That's not a works-based righteousness. It's not about doing good things. Only Jesus can save you. Okay, well, tell me how that happens. By forgiving me for the bad things I did, and then also, by the way, don't do bad things anymore. Which is not what Jesus teaches, unfortunately. It is an easy alternative to not pursuing a relationship with God, though. And it's a common alternative when one hasn't pursued a relationship with God and needs something to fill that void, which is what the Old Testament did originally. People didn't have access to God. Hebrews, we've studied that, talks about how we get access to God post-resurrection, post-ascension. People didn't have that kind of access. They had to go through a priest. You remember that? Prophet, priest, and king? They had to go through a priest to get to God. So when you don't have access to God, what do you need? You need some set of rules, right? But the incarnation changes all that. Hebrews talks about how and why. And Paul talks about how and why. Paul does an interesting take on the same thing we're talking about right now with regard to morality and the difference between the two ways we view religiosity. I always get this wrong, and I'm not going to look at it right now, but it's either Romans 1 followed by 2 or 2 followed by 3. So look that up for yourself. But in one of those chapters, Paul goes through this whole list of, don't you know that these people will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, right? And gives a whole list of the things. This is another lost in translation moment. And there are two things that matter. One is that in Greek it says, you believe that. Don't you know that you believe? So don't you know in Greek is, don't you know you believe that these people will not inherit the kingdom of heaven? You know what the very next chapter says? It's either 2 or 3, and again, I'd have to look. Neither will you because you believe that about them. And for some reason, we never want to read that. And then the entire rest of Romans is a treatise on spiritual growth, the replacement of the law of legalism with the law of grace. Law of sin and death has been overcome by the law of grace. And then Paul tries to explain what the law of grace is. So you have this consistent message throughout the entirety of Scripture that we struggle with. And here you see that in the story you guys studied on Sunday, which Shay did a great job. I hope you enjoyed having her preach. We'll have her share a message again. I enjoy teaching that passage. But in the story of the older son, we get the question answered. What did you squander? What is the inheritance? Is the inheritance salvation? Yeah, but what is that? It is relationship with God. What does the Father say? You could have had me anytime you want. Anytime you wanted. We were here the whole time. You could have had me anytime you want. Jesus confirms this later with the passage I probably quote to you more often than any other passage. On that day, people will come to me and say, didn't we do good things in your name and drive out demons in your name and heal the sick in your name? Didn't we do all the good things? That is an older son in the prodigal story statement. Didn't we do all the good things? And Jesus calls them evildoers, and says, get away from me, you evildoers, I never knew you. Time and again, Jesus says the criteria and teaches these stories. The criteria is not your behavior, it's your relationship. That's the difference. So we have people, Christians and ministers, God forgive them, who have been teaching a version of Christianity that has no hope. George Warren. Is it George? No, it's not George Warren. The third writes The Celtic Way of Evangelism, and he says this. That version of Christianity has no hope of making a meaningful difference in the world because it's leading people the wrong direction. Well, we see that here, right? Which is one of the reasons that I and other scholars struggle with this translation. Because what you get is, go into the ark, one command, with your whole household, second command. Because among this generation, because I've seen you. Translated, I know you, because I know you. Go into the ark because I know you. You're a moral man. As you read through the Scriptures, don't take my word for anything that I just said. Start reading the Scriptures together with the Spirit, and the Spirit's going to point out to you each and every one of the instances in which that message is taught. Which is also why Paul, I believe it's in Acts, I did a whole paper on this once, starts chastising the followers of Christ for trying to hold other people to their behavioral standards. That is not the purpose of Christian faith and life. If we want to do something valuable, we start by finding someone who can help us to get to know God ourselves, getting to know God ourselves, and then being that person for someone else too. So that together we fall into what the new covenant says we're supposed to do, which is to go to God. From every clean animal, there you go, take 7 pairs, a male and his mate, and from every unclean animal, take 1 pair, a male and his mate. So you have 7 pairs there in one, which is different than what we read in the previous chapter, right? A couple of different writers, most likely. But we also see that it's not just the clean animals that are saved. It is the unclean animals, or the animals that are ritually unclean, that later they're going to be told not to eat. A lot of scholars try to say, and some theologians try to use that as an opportunity to say that God doesn't just save the good things. That you can probably get that out of that. From the birds in the sky as well, take 7 pairs, male and female, so that their offspring will survive throughout the earth. In 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth. Now, 7 is, in terms of the numbers used in the scriptures, just remember that 3 and 7 and multiples thereof always refer to some version of completeness. That's always why they're there. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth. For 40 days and 40 nights I will wipe off from the fertile land every living thing that I have made. Noah did everything the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years. So you're going to see that Noah is faithful to God's guidance and God is faithful to God's word. And when the message we're supposed to get out of this is that when, and this is probably more preaching than teaching, but when we are faithful to God's guidance, the outcome is in line with God's promise. When we are not faithful to God's guidance, we end up struggling. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters arrived on earth. Noah, his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives with him entered the ark to escape the floodwaters. From the clean and unclean animals, from the birds and everything crawling on the ground. We're about to see what Noah was told, but then the writers are saying this essentially by restating everything, which is going to happen a lot. That's why I'm not spending a lot of time on it, is essentially to say, here's how Noah did what God commanded Noah to do. Not just Noah did it, but here's how Noah did it. So let's read through that. 2 of each, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, just as God commanded Noah. After 7 days, the floodwaters arrived on the earth in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month on the 7th day. The floodwaters arrived on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 7th day. On that day, listen, you catch this, all the springs of the deep sea erupted, and the windows of the skies opened. So the visual there is the waters of the deep erupt and the sky vault erupts. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Noah story with Russell Crowe depicts that. If I'm not mistaken, water comes up from below as well, which is in keeping with what the scriptures say. So it rained on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. That same day, Noah and his sons, notice that the names of his sons are written, none of the names of the women are written in here, none of them. Most scholars say that is a result of a writing coming from a patriarchal culture. The women in the stories there are only important relative to their association with the men in the story. I think probably, if you're looking at the time and the culture and place this is written, that's probably an accurate assessment. So it rained on the earth. That same day, Noah with his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's wife, his sons' 3 wives, went into the ark. They and every kind of animal, every kind of livestock, every kind that crawls on the ground, every kind of bird, they came to Noah and entered the ark, 2 of every creature that breathes, male and female. How many times have we seen that, male and female? And we've already talked, we've had 3 or 4 references to things being created in the image of God. And then immediately following that, male and female. So there's a lot to be said about being created in the image of God, but that's something that is not talked about. You've heard me say this, so I won't get on the soapbox frequently enough. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? To be created male and female, just as God commanded him. Then the Lord closed the door behind him. I am going to get on that soapbox because there's an equality issue there. Male and female are created in the image of God, not one lesser so in the image of God, but that together that is the image of God. We need to spend more time as a faith exploring what that means because we have not spent enough time exploring what that means. Okay, now I'm off the soapbox. Let me read this again, verse 16. Male and female of every creature went in just as God commanded him. So we get it. Noah is following God's guidance, right? God's command. Then the Lord closed the door behind them. The personification of God is almost always connected with the use of Yahweh. So by personification, we mean acting in less of an esoteric overseer, ruler kind of way, and more of a personally connected, doing things kind of way. There's a lot of scholars, because everybody's like, all of a sudden God is closing the door, right? Why didn't God just build the ark? But a lot of people say that there's the imagery here, and it's probably right, because there's a genre to the way that the story's being told, is that God seals them in, and God is therefore then their protector on the outside of the ark, keeping this group of people alive in the midst of the chaos that is about to ensue, which I think we'll see in a minute when we get the number of references to how the ark floated and didn't sink. The floodwaters remained on the earth, verse 17, for 40 days. The waters rose, lifted the ark, and it rode high above the earth. The waters rose and spread out over the earth. They covered all of the highest mountains under the sky. The waters rose 23 feet high, covering the mountains. Those would seem like pretty small mountains if they were only 23. We know, for instance, that the mountain that the ark came to rest on is higher than 23 feet. When you read that in Hebrew, it actually says 23 feet above the mountains. So the water rose to 23 feet above the mountains. Every creature took its last breath, verse 21. The things crawling on the ground, birds, livestock, wild animals, everything swarming on the ground, every human being. So we're decreating, right? Similar to the way that creation happened, decreation is happening. Everything on dry land with life's breaths in its nostrils died. God wiped away every living thing that was on the fertile land, from human beings to livestock to crawling things to birds in the sky. They were wiped off the earth. And just in case you haven't gotten it yet, they were wiped off the earth. Only Noah and those with him in the ark were left. The waters rose over the earth for 150 days. Now, this probably doesn't matter to you too much. We're about to get to the antediluvian story. But most scholars believe that that 40-day period is included in the 150-day period. So again, that's not a major faith issue, but just in case you're curious, most of them believe that that's included in there. So it rained, the waters were released for 40 days, and 110 days later, everything crested. From that point on, the waters begin to recede. So you've got about 5 months there, give or take, if you're looking at 5 months of 30-ish days. You've got about 5 months there before everything crested and comes to its highest point. Again, just to wrap up with where we are, now the world is back essentially where it was in Genesis 1, where the waters of the deep are covering the world. And God is going to create again, but do it in a different way, carrying over the original creation into the new recreation through the family of Noah and the animals that are on the ark. As we start next week with chapter 8, we'll get into how that process begins and how very quickly we end up having problems again as a result of human tendency to try to make decisions without consulting God. Friends, it is 11:30, and I'm going to let you go. I wanted to actually stop a little bit early. Do you remember Don Turner? Don was a member of this church, and now he is a licensed local pastor in Wayne. He's in school. He's in seminary. And he's asked me to mentor him as a part of a seminary class that he has to take, and I am supposed to call him at 11:30. So I'm going to bolt out of here as much as I would like to talk to you, and I'm going to keep that commitment to give Don a call. But I promise I'll stick around next week. So if you had questions, email me or text me or ask me Sunday or just ask me next week or something like that. I'm sorry I can't talk today. But let me pray for you before we go. God, we're grateful for the opportunity to learn together and to grow together, to have the chance to think through things that sometimes we have to take in pieces in order for your Spirit to assemble those pieces together in our spirit that helps to move us closer to being made whole. And so, God, I pray that whatever pieces we may have gained today, and in whatever way we're seeking to put them together, that you would give us the wisdom and the courage to seek to do that together with you, to ask you to think through things together with us so that we can move closer to knowing you better. And this we ask in your holy name. Amen. Thank you for coming.